Welcome to the Knowledge Problem Podcast. The objective of this podcast is to engage policy professionals over thought-provoking and sometimes sensitive topics. We aim to bring these professionals together in a way that does not feed into the tribalist narratives plaguing society today. It is my hope, and the hope of all involved in this endeavor, that by allowing these ideas to contend and challenge each other with mutual respect, everyone who listens will learn something not previously considered.
The opinions and views of all guests do not necessarily reflect the views of the Knowledge Problem or of anyone involved in its production.
Hello everyone, thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Knowledge Problem Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Pilkington, and on this episode we are exploring the role race plays in policing, the current racial atmosphere, and libertarian issues with race. Joining us, we have criminal justice researcher Jonathan Blanks. Hi John, thank you so much for joining us today. Would you mind taking a moment to introduce yourself?
I'm Jonathan Blanks. I am a criminal justice researcher at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. It's a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank that conducts original research on expanding economic opportunity for those who least have it. I spent 12 years at the Cato Institute, where I worked on criminal justice. That came after I graduated from Indiana University. I got a degree in political science. My dad was a cop, and that sort of was one of the things that drew me to criminal justice, because, I grew up, wasn't terribly into, the law and order side of things. I was a decent student, but, just like many teenagers, I got involved in some illegal activity. I never got caught, and it was fine, but I understood that there were different ways that people viewed the system, like the criminal justice system. And I went to college and I studied political science. I wanted to be a writer, and that's pretty much what I've become. But I started just looking into how the police interact with the public and what effect that has on the rest of the community. And I realized that people view the police very differently, and actually the police treat people very differently depending on where they come from and where they are. And that, I think, causes a lot of social problems that I think are underappreciated in the public policy debate. So most of my focus is on policing, but I also look at due process issues. Basically anything that follows under the criminal justice umbrella, I've probably touched on at some point or another. I'm a civil libertarian who is very skeptical of government, very skeptical of government power as they use it in the criminal justice system. I think sentences are too long. I think we have made way too many things illegal, and we should just have a better way of dealing with society's problems than just resorting to arrests and a cage and all the problems that come along with that.
So you worked at the Cato Institute for 12 years. Did you start your career at the Cato Institute, or how did you find yourself working there for so long?
I graduated in 2006, and I got an internship at the Cato Institute in January of 2007. And so I moved out to D.C. area anyway. And I was interning there, and this is when the Cato internship was much smaller. So there were, I think maybe 15 of us. And we each got two departments that we worked in, or some of us got two departments anyway. And so I worked in education and constitutional studies. And so when I was there, criminal justice was still part of the constitutional studies program. And I was thinking about going to law school. And I just got into work of Radley Balco, who's actually also an alum from Indiana University, where I was. And excuse me. And I just was completely hooked by, what the criminal justice system, looked like from a libertarian perspective, but also just how we approach that as a society. As I said, I was a political science major, so I was doing foreign policy and thinking about American government sort of writ large, and I wasn't thinking too much about criminal justice. But because of learning all of this and thinking about my dad as a cop in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where I grew up, and all of his experiences, particularly as an African-American cop from 1958 to 1978 in Indiana, which some people have referred to as the southern state of the North, more a little more vulgarly as the South's middle finger. But so I mean, we had, the Klan ran the state in the early part of the 20th century. We had, Indiana has its pretty nasty race problems, right? So it became very fascinating for me to like dig into and think about. And so I just sort of, over my 12 years there, sort of just developed a lot of writing that deals with policing, criminal justice, but also race issues. And one of the things that sort of the reason why you invited me on the podcast is, at least I'm guessing, was that years ago, because I'm African American and most libertarians are not in the United States, someone asked me, it's like, so John, why do you think that there aren't many Black libertarians? And so I turned it into an article that I wrote for libertarianism.org, and I've written a couple since then and done podcasts with Aaron and Trevor over at Free Thoughts, just sort of exploring these ideas and thinking about it, because libertarians, you would think, just sort of abstractly, that people skeptical of the government, of all people in the United States, Black people would be like right at the top of that list. Yet if you go to any like libertarian function in DC, you're going to see very few Black faces. And so the libertarians have been trying to do better, I think, at least within DC and certainly at Cato. But it has been a slog for them, frankly. And there's a bunch of reasons for that, which I'm sure we'll get into.
One major reason I wanted to invite you on the podcast was because you gave our intern class a lecture on libertarian issues with race, and that was one of the most powerful lectures I think we heard during our session. And I'm aware you recently wrote an article in the Washington Post exploring the Second Amendment and how white people and Black people utilize the right to bear arms differently. Would you like to discuss your article a bit? And in light of recent events that have happened since you've written it, would you change anything about it or add anything to it?
Well, I think the Washington Post story, I mean, for those who haven't read it, is basically how Black protesters and white protesters get treated very differently, particularly when they bring guns to the Capitol. And it really ties in with what citizenship looks like for both Black and white Americans. And yes, if I were rewriting the piece, given what's been going on around the country and seeing police officers, tear gassing and using pepper spray on completely compliant, peaceful demonstrators, police officers ramming through barricades with their SUVs. It's completely different. I saw earlier on Twitter today that, images of, officers physically struggling with white protesters at state capitals. And, they didn't use tear gas. They weren't using rubber bullets. They weren't doing any of these, very aggressive, violent things against peaceful protesters there. And, it's just absolutely stunning. But it does get back to the broader point that, American protest has always been very key to the American identity, and for good and worse, so have guns. And yet, I think the public reaction to if these Black Lives Matter protesters were showing up with firearms draped around their neck, the entire, I think so much of this country would convulse in absolute horror at that prospect. But at the same time, when they do it at Michigan State Capitol, when white people do it at a Michigan State Capitol waving Trump flags and Confederate battle flags, a lot of people are just like, well, that's not cool, but that's what they did, right? So it's just these dichotomies that Black people see, and others obviously see in our lives every day, and that white people are still treated different and better than Black people are generally. Now, granted, to be clear, the Black Lives Matter protests and everything going on in the country as we tape this is multicultural, and there are people of all races that are participating. but certainly their perspective is, and the reason for protest is bringing completely different reactions from the public and the police.
Do you feel like these protests that are happening currently are encouraging, or is it more like this might be a turning point in like actual like equality, or do you take more of a pessimistic view towards them? Or
well, I mean, considering the curfews that are going on and the National Guard being brought in so many places, it's hard to be positive about this right now. Depending on what city you're in, the police response has generally been to escalate in violence and escalate in cracking down, and the crowds are just getting bigger and bigger, and they don't understand that like they're doing the exact wrong thing. So yeah, I'm actually very frightened for what's going to happen between now and even when this podcast goes live. So I am not very optimistic about it. I think more people are starting. I hope more people are understanding how serious this is, but at the same time, I don't want the disconnect between the Black community and the police is right. But at the same time, I don't want to discount what is going on, and it's not, unfortunately, I think too many people really want to have a simple answer for this, like, oh, it's Antifa or it's white anarchists or white supremacist anarchists that are doing this violence, and other people are, once these things get started, no one's really in control, and therefore trying to give like some sort of one umbrella answer about what's going on, I think is it's way too narrow to be accurate, right? It's, I think in some places, violence is you're like throwing back tear gas cans and tearing up, storefronts and all that sort of stuff, which of course I don't condone, but, can be a natural just outrage about being tear gassed while being peaceful, right? That seems normal. Then you see, what we're seeing around DC and other places where it's a bunch of spray paint and graffiti and clearly politically motivated reaction, whether it's violence, property damage, what have you. And so like he didn't accidentally show up with spray paint, right? that didn't happen. So so there clearly are some just like forces of chaos that are in those, because again, when the larger that these groups get, the harder they are to control, whether you are acting as the police or you're acting as protesters that are trying to maintain a peaceful march or demonstration, whatever it is. I saw a video recently of there was a guy dressed all in black, covered face, and he was, I don't know exactly what he was doing, but it's here in DC, and he was like just destroying property like on the ground, and we did like he was like just tearing up some concrete. And the protesters went to the police and tearing that guy, and he's like, he's not one of us. This is not it. Nope. And they got him out, right? But of course, by the end of that day, terrible things were happening to buildings all over the city. Well, not over the city, but in various parts of the city. So there are just too many different elements to put it all together in that respect. I think what's different to me about this particular demonstration so far, it's just like the unbelievable impunity with which these officers are acting, like officers taking aim at media personalities that are on air at the time. Like I saw the guy, I think it was a paintball gun or something along those lines, like tried to shoot the reporter. The gun jammed. He redid it and then hit her. And and he was on camera. And the like just random pepper spraying of people just driving by and just, a few years ago when Occupy was doing their thing, and there was that sit-in on Berkeley's campus, and that guy just sort of casually pepper sprayed an entire line of sit-in protesters. That dude was vilified all over the country. Just, he put his name on the internet and people were like, oh, try and take this down, which of course just made the internet trolls, double down and put his face everywhere and memed him and all that sort of stuff. And now I saw a video last night of a Richmond, Virginia police officer shooting pepper spray into a guy's window, an open guy's, like, what? That is absolutely, reprehensible and illegal. And yet these officers, and so there's a defense lawyer out of North Carolina on Twitter. His name is Greg Doucette. And I think I'm pronouncing his last name right. I'm not sure. And he's been collecting tweets and videos of cops doing blatantly illegal things. And he's been running this for, I think, 2 days at this point. And he's already up to 100. And that's a lot. And it's not just like, oh, well, these things are a little over the top. It's like, no, plainly, just plain gross use of force, whether it's pepper spray or using violence and not attending to people. Like there was video of this young woman getting thrown so violently to the ground by a respectively giant cop compared to how big she was, thrown on the ground. He was doing it right in front of a white shirt, which is lieutenant or higher in the NYPD. And they just kept walking, and no officer offered, medical attention. Now, if she did something, and their video came out later, showed she did nothing illegal. But even if she had done something like, say, spit on a cop or something that would be illegal and could be in some way addressed with some sort of use of force, she should have been arrested. But she wasn't. And so they used force against her and, in a way that caused some, I don't think any, serious, very serious injury, and just walked by. I mean, that's not acceptable. So there's just a lot of that. So I think when all of this is said and done, the very long list of unbelievable police abuses that are on video that cannot be explained away, that this is just like, oh, it was a heat of the moment sort of stuff. Just like it's going to be very damning, I think, to the people who have supported police for a very long time. And so maybe there's something that good will come out of that. But right now, if you're asking me, do I think it's going to get worse before it gets better? I think unfortunately, the answer is yes, it's going to get much worse before it gets better. I hope I'm wrong. I really do.
Oh, I hope you're wrong too. One issue that I see on my feed is that a lot of people are being blinded to what the protesting is all about because they're focusing on property damage, and I was wondering if you see the same thing.
I have a mix of, I follow a mix of people, and what I've been heartened by are police leaders and police officers who are on social media who are denouncing what they see, the same excesses I was just describing, the wanton use of violence against nonviolent people. And while they and I probably have different opinions of when force is, appropriate, or, whether or not you should use, like when you should deploy tear gas or anything like that, they are standing up, understanding that what happened to George Floyd in the beginning is, absolutely unconscionable. And they're calling again, they're calling for the other three officers. At the time of this, we're recording, the officer who had his knee on him has been arrested, but the other three who have been fired have not been arrested yet. They're calling for them to be arrested and that sort of thing. And they understand that they need to build these relationships with the community. And the thing is, having worked in this space for a long time, I know that there are police officers and police departments that are really very conscious of what is going on and what they need to do, and the fact they do need to build these relationships. But there is a disconnect between, in some departments, leadership understands that, but the front line doesn't get it. In other departments, the front line really gets it because they understand they're the people who have to go out and deal with people literally every day. Like I don't think people understand how often cops come into contact with people like on the job, particularly in areas where they have a lot of calls for service, right? And so they understand that they cannot be hated everywhere that they go. And so they have started to react to be much more empathetic, to be much more professional, to not antagonize the people that they run into every day. And that's really good. Unfortunately, some departments will have their frontline officers, their patrol officers do that. When you just see, the cops that you see when you're driving down the street and you just see them on the side of the road, whether they're, on a speed trap or if they're just being there to be visible, that's who you see. But there are specialized units, whether it's SWAT team or gang units or gun units or something along those lines, that are still doing the old stuff, and they're doing it wrong. And they are violating people's civil rights and they're making their arrests and they're recovering guns. But a lot of times, particularly here in DC, for example, the gun recovery unit is a notorious unit, and like 40% of their cases get tossed, like for constitutional violations. Like, they got guns off the street, but their arrests aren't doing anything other than disrupting people's lives. And so it's like you have a disconnect between the frontline officers who are trying to have a good relationship with the people that they have to deal with every day, and these specialized officers who are completely incentivized to go out and shake people down for guns and not really caring about what that effect has on all those innocent people that didn't have guns, that they stopped and they shook down and probably illegally searched, or very often illegally searched anyway. And what that does to the community and the relationship between the police and the public. And again, because these happen primarily in black neighborhoods, you don't see this stuff done in Georgetown. The very posh predominantly white shopping district on the northwest part of town. They just don't operate there. And there's a great opinion in the DC Circuit Court of Appeals several years ago called U.S. v. Gross. And I don't have the text in front of me, but I can summarize it, where then Judge Janice Roger Brown, she's since taken senior status, but she wrote the majority opinion saying, the gun recovery unit is operating within the bounds of the Constitution, right? But she concurred, and this is a way to signal the Supreme Court. She's like, look, because this is what precedent says, that's what I had to write. I had to say that this comports with the Supreme Court's view of the Constitution. And she never used the word race once. But she's like, you try this in Georgetown and you're going to tell me that this happens? Like, she literally said, try this in Georgetown. The gun recovery unit was known as, like, they're known colloquially as jump out cars. So cops jump out of cars, sometimes wearing tactical gear, and sometimes with their guns drawn, and then ask for consent to search someone to see if they have an illegal weapon. Of course, if you have a gun pointed at you, if someone's asking you a question, you will tell them what they want to hear, right? That's just a natural reaction. And so, yes, and the idea that that's freely given consent, according to the Supreme Court, yeah, it's fine. But the thing is, it doesn't happen to rich white people, and it happens to poor black people. And most of the people it happens to are completely innocent, and that's the thing. And so people are like, well, black people are more violent. I don't remember that being an exception to the Constitution, even if we put aside what all the racist implications of saying that are. But if the fact is that the Constitution does not apply the same in Southeast DC that is predominantly black that it is in Northwest DC, which is predominantly white, and that just gets to the core of the problem with policing. And so, again, bringing it back to these protests right now, I see a lot of people who are like, oh, wow, this is, sort of the people who are like, okay, I'm getting it. I'm seeing these police officers doing bad stuff. This is bad. We need to get these bad apples out of the department. And yes, you have these horrific killings, like the one that prompted these protests, and they are by officers who have checkered past, who should have been drummed out of the department and who should have been probably prosecuted before for other uses of force. And yes, that is part of it, and it is an important part, and we need to, stop that. We need to get those officers out of the department. But the problem is like what I just described in the gun recovery unit case here in DC, that's just standard operating procedure, right? That's just policing. It's not, according to the Supreme Court, it's legal, so you can't sue over it. And because it's department policy, certainly there's not going to be an administrative remedy for that. So no one's going to get fired for doing what you were asked to do or told to do. And of course, if it's, you can't sue over it and you can't get fired for it, you're certainly not going to get criminally charged for it, right? So, and I think that's going to be the next hurdle, is trying to get people to understand that is this disparate policing is at the core of the complaint. It's not just the bodies in the street, as crude and horrible as that sounds. That is a very small percentage of the abuse that police inflict upon people every year. I think the biggest example of this is the Philando Castile shooting, which was also in the Twin Cities metro area in Minnesota, right? Philando Castile, legal concealed carry owner, got pulled over. His girlfriend took video after he was shot by the police officer after he had reached. He's like, "I'm carrying my weapon. I'm letting you know." And the cop completely freaked out about this black guy with a gun and shot him. And a couple things before we even get into that, is like, a legal concealed carry owner has never been convicted of a felony. Just cannot. Doesn't matter if it's just one of the things. No misdemeanor domestic battery, no felonies. That's just to actually own a gun in this country. Forget concealed carry. And then on top of it, different states have different rules. But so we know that Philando Castile does not have an extensive criminal record. Before that traffic stop where he was shot and killed, he had been pulled over 49 times in 13 years. And only 2 of those, I think it was 1 stop sign and 1 clear speeding ticket, was not some sort of either very subjective violation, basically those little, getting too close to the yellow line or something like that. Not swerving, just getting too close to the yellow line. These are all subjective things that every driver does every time they get behind the wheel of a car, because there's just been there are so many ways to violate the law. The officers can just basically, if they want to pull you over, they'll figure out a reason to do it. He got pulled over 49 times in 13 years. He was a victim before he was shot and killed. And that is the difference that I don't think enough people are getting from everything that's being protested and everything that's going on right now. The people think it's just about killing people. And yes, that's very bad. And yes, we want that to stop, but that's not the only thing. Most people who get stopped by the police are not shot and killed. But people particularly black people, have a lot of contact with police, and they're all very often negative, and that just continues to wear at and destroy any positive relationship that could happen between the police and the black community.
You touched a bit on over-policing, and you also mentioned how some police departments were showing solidarity with the protesters. There were some pictures circulating around social media where police would even be taking a knee with protesters. While that seems great, there's probably some policies that could address the issues at hand. Representative Justin Amash recently introduced the End Qualified Immunity Act to Congress. Do you think that would have substantial effect on over-policing? For those who don't know, qualified immunity is a court-made doctrine from 1982 that basically said that the civil rights protection that you have, that every American has, it's colloquially known as Section 1983, but it was a civil rights statute that was put into law after the Civil War that says, and I again don't have text in front of me, but that if a government agent violates your constitutional rights, they shall be held liable for it. And in this particular case, it means they can be sued. And so if they violate your rights, you can sue them for damages. In 1982, the Supreme Court said, well, we're going to develop this doctrine called qualified immunity, which says it has to be the constitutional violation has to have been clearly established in the jurisdiction in which it happened before. Otherwise, the officer cannot be held liable. There's no constitutional basis for this. There's no textual basis for this. It was basically just a way to protect police from
being sued. And the really messed up thing is police officers are indemnified, which means they actually don't pay anything out of pocket. The city pays for it. So anytime an officer gets sued, it's not his money; it's the city's money. But so that's another problem. But so Justin Amash it said he's going to propose this bill, which of course, in my independent capacity, because I work for the organizations I work with are 501c3, so I can't endorse any legislation. But I am very happy to see this sort of bill go through, to be proposed, because it is just, there's no reason for that to exist. This is because police departments are terrible about holding officers accountable for violations of law or violations of policy, and it's almost impossible to get a criminal charge against them. The one place of redress is civil courts. And so, yes, I think getting rid of qualified immunity is a really great idea. As of right now, the Supreme Court has not granted a qualified immunity case yet. There are, I believe, 4 cases that they've consolidated that they are continuing to consider in their weekly conferences. And they have yet to grant them, but they haven't denied them either. So people think, and several of the justices have at various points in the past few years publicly questioned, either in their judicial writings or in other settings, have questioned the doctrine of qualified immunity. And so there's a lot of hope in the reform community. Surprisingly, this is not a partisan issue. There is bipartisan support. I think there were two editorials written recently. I think the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times basically both came out against qualified immunity as a doctrine. George Will wrote a post talking about this horrible doctrine. So, yes, I think it's a good thing. I don't think it's going to address over-policing. I think this is going to be more in the line of officers who cross the line. The legal line will be able to be civilly liable, which is good. And it is definitely good, but it's not going to change over policing because, again, if the Supreme Court thinks that the sort of over policing of the jump out cars is legal, they can't. If it's legal, you can't sue over it, right? Your rights weren't violated because they said, oh, well, this is something they did in the course of their duties. So yes, as long as that's found justified. So yeah, they're different issues. I think it's a very huge deal in the realm of whether it comes legislatively or through litigation of the Supreme Court. It's huge for police misconduct, but it isn't. It's not going to be sufficient to address police policy, and that's why I approach this not necessarily from a legal perspective, from it as a policy one, to get just as community policing there's no law saying that community policing is something that police officers should do. It's an idea that police officers need to be more engaged with the community and in a non-antagonistic way, instead of jumping out of their cars and saying, hey, where are you going? What are you doing? Can I empty your pockets? They are, hey, how are you doing? Everything doing okay? I'm Officer So-and-so. If you ever have a problem, you please let me know. This is my card. I'm here to try, I want to be part of this community too, that sort of stuff. That's community policing. And so it has to be from a policy goal. We have to convince police departments that it is in their departmental interest to treat people better. But they have this really ingrained tendency to, they have their way of thinking about things. I was just on watching a call earlier. A bunch of people that are involved in evidence-based policing, which is a growing field of study and policy research about what works in policing and what doesn't. And it uses, controlled experiments. It's really bringing science into policing, which we really haven't had up until the past 10 or 15 years, to really figure out what works. So, for example, there are cops to this day who think that DARE works, the drug abuse resistance education that so many American kids grew up with. And study after study after study after study after study have shown that it has no effect, and I mean zero effect on drug use among children or as they become adults. It's like it doesn't do anything. And so it's stuff like that, but it's also, different ways to bring down violent crime in an area. It can be, best ways to decrease shoplifting, or it could be any number of things. If you can just if you can have a control group and a test group and being able to compare this information. And but anyway, on the call today, they were talking about, fentanyl. And, I think anyone who's paid attention to is sort of the noise around drug arrests and fentanyl and all these terrible overdoses that have happened, people have heard stories about cops ODing after touching fentanyl, like they're just touching their hands or something along those lines. And it turns out that that's not true, but cops believe this. And one of the side effects of this happening is that a cop who believes that if they touch fentanyl, they could die, will, and they realize that they touch something that they believe is fentanyl, they'll have a panic attack. And so they'll start hyperventilating, and they get lightheaded, and that gives them a feeling that they're high, and and that's just going to sort of feed that fear. And so they can hyperventilate, pass out, and all. They're like, oh no, this cop had a bad reaction to this fentanyl. And so it gets reported as cop ODs on fentanyl by touching it. And that's not really what happens. But cops all over the country still believe this. They're not very good at sharing that sort of information, that this is actually what's going on. And so that applies just as much to actual policies. So they see an uptick in crime. Their tradition tells them they need to get more feet out on the street. They need to get more people in that area, which to an extent can be true, because we have data showing that visible police presence actually does decrease the likelihood of crime reoccurring. But getting up in people's faces and searching them for guns, while it will recover guns, it will not actually make the area safer. What's making the area safer is the police presence. But while you're there, you're just harassing people and making them angry. And so that's not helpful policing. So it's a very long-winded way of saying cops believe a lot of stuff that isn't true. And one of the things that we need to do as researchers and as policymakers is try to encourage police departments to increase the communication and the good communication of doing things that they do. Right now, it's just sort of like, oh, well, we wrote a directive. We told them what the directive is, and then they go and do it. And the cops on the front lines don't understand why they're doing it. They're just being told that's what they're going to do, and so that's what they do. I did some ride-alongs with the DC police a couple of years ago, and turns out that they, at the time we were talking about implementing, taking demographic data of, the people that they stop. And so the people who work in areas where like 95% of the residents are Black understand, because policing is very geographically, to back up a second, policing tends to be very geographically isolated. So you're here in DC, for example, you're assigned to one of the policing districts, one of the 7 policing districts in the city. And then within that, you have a sort of a micro district. Policing area is what they call it. And so that is where you are. So that is where you, unless there is a code where like someone got shot or something where like a bunch of people our officers are called to be there in an emergency, the people you're going to be dealing with are the people who live in that particular area. And so these officers who work in 95% Black areas, think that they're going to be hurt because the people that they come into contact with are almost always going to be Black. And just because they're counting and they need them to count how many people that they stopped that were Black, they don't understand that they're not going to get dinged for that because researchers who want to use this data will, understand if they're in a black neighborhood, right? And so they get freaked out. They start resenting the fact that they have to do this sort of stuff because no one's explained anything to them. And so it's just this horrible lack of communication within a policing structure, which again doesn't mean that anyone's being bad or racist or terrible about stuff. It's just, as far as malice, it's just bad communication. And so it's really incumbent for people like me and the police departments to work together to try and get people to get officers to understand why they're doing what we're asking them to do.
So it's a marathon, not a sprint.
It's more of climbing up a very steep rock face, I think. As someone who's never done anything like that, my upper body strength is the upper body strength is not my thing. But yeah, it's that. It's very slow. It's very hard. A slip can set you back considerably. But there are signs of good things, like as you mentioned, cops kneeling down with protesters. One of the worst police departments in the country 15 years ago was Camden, New Jersey. And so many cases of corruption, abuse, and all that sort of stuff. They blew up that police department, not literally, not like fire, but they fired every single police officer, and they rebuilt, and they rehired some of them back after a vetting process, and then they brought in other officers to change the culture of that police department. They were the people who were marching in solidarity with the people in their communities. Does that fix everything in Camden? No. Does that mean that there are no problems in Camden? Oh, certainly not. That they still have problems with their police department. But that's just kind of the nature of policing. You expect people to, you're just running into people's civil rights. You're dealing with unfreedom. That's what, policing is. So of course there are problems there, but they didn't have the problems that, happened in DC or happened in my hometown of Fort Wayne, Indiana. They didn't, that's an improvement. It just didn't happen everywhere. And yeah, again, people speculate, and we'll find out eventually, if there were any agents provocateur or, just outside agitators or whatever. I think it varies, from area to area, but there have been improvements, and there can be improvements, and that's, you kind of have to focus on those when you're trying to think of is it really worth it to keep trying doing this? Because I had some conversations with other reformers on Twitter as we're watching these horrific videos of cops just doing completely inexcusable stuff and doing it knowing that they're on camera. That was one thing. It's they don't understand that they're on camera, and you're just sort of seeing okay, because we've all seen terrible things about cops doing things, which is clearly arresting CNN reporters while they're on air. What? Are you kidding? And then they send out a statement well, once we realized he was a journalist. Absolutely not true. Absolutely not true. And here we are, there's a group of people known as police abolitionists, and there's some on the left and the right. The ones on the left get a lot more press, but they're basically socialists, and or many of them are socialists anyway. And they basically want to take money from the police and put it in the community, which I really don't have a problem with. But their ultimate goal is to get rid of police altogether. And I don't find this persuasive because of, I think, what is more of a libertarian view of sort of no public police, which are to have private security organizations. But if you've read Anarchy, State, and Utopia, you realize that even Nozick is yeah, we got to have public police, because otherwise you're just going to have sort of warring factions of security forces. But from a more practical, what would happen in the United States standpoint, when you look at what happened to Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, where he was shot by two white dudes who were thinking that they were vigilantes, and what happened to Trayvon Martin in Florida years ago. That's, those were people who thought that they were cops or wanted to play cop. And I fear that happening. And so, if that, makes me not libertarian enough for people, that's fine. But, that's why I still believe that there should be cops at some level. I cannot sign on to police abolition. But I mean, they are a growing part of the reform community. Well, they don't want reform, they want abolition. They are part of the people who are being critical of police officers. And here we are as reformers saying, no, we can't get rid of police officers. We need them. We just need to change what they're doing. And there are those of us who, in the face of this just complete impunity, don't care about anyone's rights, just, throwing stuff in their faces, throwing people down on the ground, knowing that they're on camera. And we're sitting here like, abolition. I can see why someone would believe that. And it puts us in a really horrible situation. That sounded terrible. It's a very difficult position to be in, to be someone who is not actually anti-cop and anti-policing. And, but the officers are at this point, so much of the evidence that we have, it's indefensible. And so you can understand the abolitionist point of view. But we've always known that horrible things happen. It's just like you try to make it so the system doesn't react that badly anymore, or the individuals within that system. But this is one of the most depressing things I've ever seen.
So I want to touch on libertarian issues with race. What do you think most libertarians get wrong on race? And do you think that stems from malice or ignorance?
Well, I think that there are a bunch of things going on. So to be very clear, when I've written about this before, I'm speaking almost exclusively about American libertarians. Because in every different culture and country, you're going to have different pre-existing social tensions, right? So like in India, you've got a caste system, and in other countries, you've got, various tribes of people that, don't get along with each other. So in the American context, it is quite clearly race, and it has been since before the country was founded. And I think American libertarians have two main problems that I can think of. I mean, there are plenty more, but the two that stand out is sort of the rather naive, like, I don't see color cop-out. I mean, it's also very common among Americans generally, whereas, people are individuals, and because libertarianism is such an individualized philosophy, people are going to say, why are we making this about race? Why is this something, I judge people individually, which is fine, and you should, but the idea that race doesn't have broader meanings in this culture today is, I think, very naive. And we'll get into that a little bit more. And second, I think there has been culturally speaking, the libertarians have, rightly or wrongly, been associated with the political right, the Republicans. And there are certain political tropes that cut down racial lines. They always have. And so there is this sort of cultural crossover between the two, where there's just this skepticism of what someone today might call the SJWs, the social justice warriors. Like anytime that someone of the left or the progressive left starts complaining about racism, there's just the libertarian reaction is a negative one. And they don't want to see what racial consequences still exist in this country, and they're just people are individually driven, and they're basically, responsible for their own lives, and therefore blaming it on race is just, it's nonsense. And I think it's just not understanding the country for what it is, as opposed to not. I don't think most libertarians, obviously I wouldn't have stayed at Cato for 12 years if I thought Cato is racist or anything, but insofar as I think most libertarians there's no malice there. It's just that they've been acculturated to not thinking race is as is important to people's experiences in the United States as it is to many people. It's obviously not universal, but that is something that I think libertarians underestimate. Now, there are other strains of libertarians that I'm not going to, call out individually, but insofar as if there is a strain where basically the South was right in the Civil War, that's going to go hand in hand with some people who are definitely not thinking, and there are non-racist reasons to believe that, I suppose, but it's not something that I take seriously.
One of the first times I was really confronted with systemic racial issues was when I interacted with a sociology professor on campus. Personally, that interaction, while uncomfortable, it was important in my own awakening on these issues. Do you think there's a reason most libertarians are less inclined to study sociology as opposed to philosophy, history, or economics?
Having not myself gotten too familiar with the sociological literature, I can't speak too much on that. I will say that being around libertarians for most of my professional life, I know that there's definitely a group of people that do not believe that sociology is like a legitimate social science. And so that's going to be its own problem. But I think getting beyond like sort of personal reactions or thoughts about sociology, I think the libertarian, a very dominant libertarian worldview, at least in policy circles and in the sort of DC professional libertarian circles, is that I'm sort of guilty of this myself, that like the part of the attraction of libertarianism and particularly as a philosophy and economics as well, is that it provides a very good explanation of how systems work. And so if you're just like, okay, so if you have X, Y, and Z inputs into a system, you're going to get out, 1, 2, and 3 outputs, right? And I think that's very attractive to people who have spent their entire lives questioning why. And I think there's a very strong strain of that among libertarians. They question a lot. They question authority. And having systemic explanations for why people behave the way they do, is very attractive. And so I think that's a sort of natural. I can't, give a plug for any, sociology department anywhere, but I think really there is less interest in how people or certain groups of people, react and think of things. Like you go back to some of the early sociological work, like the Philadelphia Negro by W.E. Du Bois, and other sort of very deep down cultural, like measuring, cultural phenomena. That's not something that a lot of libertarians, I think, are very drawn to, because they're like, I don't care what people think. I want to see how systems work, right? And it's not, and I'm not trying to put words in anyone's mouth, but that seems to me like, and particularly early in my life, I think I would have probably been someone who would have said something along those lines, or at least, try to articulate something like that. But as I've gotten older and just read a lot more, that I think it's less important that there's a particular discipline that libertarians should be more open to. I just think they need to be more open to things they don't agree with, and particularly in a way that is less sort of, I'm reading this to take it down, and like reading something or engaging with some discipline or text to actually really understand it and to deal with it. I think, when I first came to Cato and just the broader libertarian movement, I got books and books and books and books of various libertarian thinkers and philosophers and economists, and I ate it up, and it was great, and it was awesome. And then I was like, I would like to read something else now. But a lot of people don't. I mean, you think that, and this isn't talking about Cato in any particular way, just sort of generally people like to read what they agree with. People like to watch what they agree with. That's sort of the problem with our news, like taking libertarianism away for a moment. Like that's sort of problem with our media culture, right? Now that we have so many choices, people seek out what they want to hear. And so it's very easy to get caught in your own bubble, regardless if it's an ideological bubble like libertarianism, or if it's like Fox News watching conservative, or a bleeding heart liberal who watches MSNBC. All these different things are this. It's less about taking other information and learning from it, and it's just so much easier to Piketty's got a new book out. Let's go tear it up. And not that I have really strong thoughts on Tom Piketty or anything. It's just that is sort of the way that I think the think tanks and a lot of think tanks and people in that orbit think, right? And again, this is not in no way to criticize Cato. Actually, I really applaud Cato because they've always, when I was there and to this day, always try to encourage the best argument from the other side to bring that forward and to engage with it honestly. It's one of the best things I learned actually as an intern. Before I came to Cato, I was very sarcastic and my writing was very acidic. And I think it was Tom Palmer who was just like, it's just much more important to assume best intentions from the other side when you're arguing with them, and instead of partially because it's just it's what a civil person does, but also because it actually makes your arguments better. But I think it's still too easy for people to just get caught in reaffirming what they believe and trying to make their arguments better that way than really engage with things that may be foreign to them.
With Reaganism, the political alliance between conservatives and libertarians, also known as fusionism, was formed. As both sides seek to distinguish themselves, it seems like some libertarians have held on to some more conservative views, especially on racial issues. And do you think that's lingering effects of fusionism, or is something else going on?
I think fusionism is, it's less about fusionism per se than it's like if you hang out with libertarians in DC, right, you will often you'll see some Republicans. I'm not into the libertarian scene as I was 10 years ago. We used to go out all the time, and we would go to events that were sponsored by Heritage and ATR and all these different groups, and there was just a lot more intermingling between the libertarians and the political right. And I don't know if these things still go on, but there just seemed to be this sort of, there's still that social connection, regardless of how they feel politically, that there within the DC area, there seems to just be this cooperation. Again, it's sort of, they will disagree about certain things, like certainly libertarians were pro-gay marriage, conservatives less so. They were against it. Let's be serious. So, but they would still get along. It was just that they have, differences of opinion. And if you look at the Federalist Society, right, it's a debate club for policy wonks and lawyers. And they, cover a pretty wide range between, hardcore anarchist libertarians and Sam Alito. It's like that. That's pretty. It's pretty wide as far as the right is concerned. So socially, they still interact, and as I said, there's still that social reflex to just be like, oh, the SJWs are at it again, right? And those are still shared goals, or shared. It's shared socialization. And so I think that's very often, it's like the libertarians are still very skeptical of racial thinking, of thinking of race as relevant. And I think that's to their detriment. It's not, Again, for the most part, I don't think it's malice. I just think that it's much easier to think of problems in a much broader scope. It's like, well, race is a social construct, so we don't have to think about we shouldn't have to think about this thing that really doesn't make any difference or sense. Yet, so why do we keep talking about this? Yet, if you look at certain policy areas like mine, like criminal justice, like the racial disparities are all over the place. You cannot get away from it. It's just there. It's like, if the libertarians want to start explaining things, they need to explain that. And too often when that attempt happens, they fall back on the old Republican tropes like, oh, well, black people just need to apply themselves more. Black people need to, it's like get off welfare or something along those lines. And that gets really offensive. And so surprisingly, not surprising at all, black people aren't very keen on that sort of thinking. But I mean, there are efforts that I know that Cato has made internally to try and get better at outreach, but it's just real difficult because this is a very partisan town, and most of the black professionals here are going to be Democratic or progressive affiliated, and it's just difficult to get. It's a very polarized town. It's not impossible, but it is. If you're filing, if your organization is working in a way that seems like cooperating with the conservatives on racially sensitive issues like, say, voting rights, then it's going to be very difficult to get black people to take that organization very seriously. It's going to, or at least to take them as allies on much of anything. And rather than worry about converting people and trying to get people to think of a certain way, as I told your intern class, and I've told many intern classes, it's like, stop worrying about conversion. You need to start with I'm not the enemy. And because that is where a lot of people view the libertarians on race issues, right? I mean, one of the most famous, like the closest thing to that the libertarians have ever had to a major party presidential nominee was Barry Goldwater. He got famous and he had his support because he opposed the Civil Rights Act. That is not something that is going to sell to black people. Like, it's just not going to work. And libertarians still will get so hung up on, well, you really shouldn't coerce, private entities to not be racist. But it's like, if you look at the history of the country, we waited, how long until the markets were going to fix this? And it's like, how long can just blatant injustice go on before it's too late? You just can't do it. We can't have nice things like federalism. Because that's why we had a civil war, right? It's like, I still believe in federalism, but you can understand that federalism can go too far. And such is ideally we wouldn't have a law saying that, you can discriminate on the basis of race. But when you have an entire section of the country and outside of where it was actually the law, the Jim Crow South, they had codified that racism, right? But you still had segregation in the West, out in California and Arizona. You still had segregation in Indiana where it wasn't legal, where it wasn't law. You have so many of our cities today are still segregated. And it's just as a de facto matter, even though it's not in law, and the libertarians have never come up with a good explanation how to fix that. And until that is something that the libertarians take seriously as a policy matter, let alone come up with a solution for it, it's going to be very difficult to get any sort of significant support from the black community.
So you started your career as a criminal justice researcher, and I mean, you still do that, but was there any significant event during your time as a criminal justice researcher that sort of made you focus on the racial aspects of it?
Obviously, people who can't see me aren't going to know this. So I look relatively fair. I look white, or at least vaguely, I look vaguely ethnic, but not. No one would look at me and think, "Oh my God!" I mean, oh, that's a black guy, right? Because I am what people would call passing back in the day. And so I passed for white. So growing up in Indiana, when I did, which is the 1980s and early 90s, I heard a bunch of racist stuff my whole life. And so race has always been a thing like in my life. I haven't always had the same view on it. I haven't always had the same identification. Like I identify as black even though I don't look black, but that took time because I had to think about it and what it meant to me and, what all this is because, in 7th grade, someone asked me, in the 6th or 7th grade, someone was like, so John, you're going to be black, you're going to be white. And I'm like, what? Huh? I mean, how do you answer that? Like 13 years old. Like what? I'm just who I am. My dad is white. I mean, my dad is black. My mom is white. Like I am my parents' son. What do you want me to say? And so race has always been an issue. And that's one of the things that gets me when people say, why do people talk about race all the time? And they bring up Al Sharpton and a bunch of other stuff that doesn't matter. Like if I had to deal with race in a very different way than most black people because I hear racist stuff that people who are recognized as black just generally don't hear. Certainly not in casual conversation. Whereas I can walk through a mall or, a department store and no one's going to think anything about it. I'm not going to get trailed because I look suspicious, all that sort of stuff. I don't fit the profile or fit the description, but black people do. I mean, visibly black people do. And the idea that, people only care about race because Al Sharpton said so is just absolutely infuriating. So race has always been something that's been, it's always been present in my life. It's not always something that I've focused on, but it's just part of my life. It's part of who I am. Right. And so, but as coming out of college, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was thinking about going to law school, but I didn't know exactly to do what. I just really enjoyed taking constitutional law in undergrad, and I got to Cato, and it was just like, okay. But I grew up in black neighborhoods. I went to, I went to a very racially diverse school. And there were differences. There were just obvious differences between the way black people and white people view the world, how black people and white people experience the world, and how the world treated them. And so that's it's just always been there. And so as I started to get into criminal justice, it's just obvious, it's just there. You can't get away from it. There are people who sort of deny it. But generally speaking, those who work in criminal justice who don't want to talk about race issues are either basically told not to, or they have opinions about why so many black people are incarcerated that it has nothing. They're just which their arguments are essentially going to be, well, black people deserve it. And obviously that's not something that I can subscribe to. I mean, I'm not saying that every black person who's in prison is innocent. I'm just saying that there are very deep-seated problems that go way back in this country that we haven't addressed yet, and these contribute to why are among many things that contribute to the disparities in arrests, the disparities in incarceration, and so on. And so yeah, it's sort of a chicken and egg thing. I mean, definitely race came before it, but because my views on race have changed over time, it's, I can't say that it was sort of destined or anything. It was just, the more you read about it, the more you realize, sort of the racial mechanisms that have always existed in this country and how they've evolved and changed over time. That, it's fascinating to read whether or not you want to pursue this as policy work, but it is disturbing. And I don't think most people understand how this stuff happened. Right. The evolution of how Virginia went from, indentured servitude, which included white people and Irish people and that sort of thing, and how it became race-based slavery. And, and then over time you've got how racial segregation happened, how slavery evolved, but, at the beginning of the founding of the United States, Thomas Jefferson looked at slavery as a necessary evil. By the time we get to the Civil War, you've got, Alexander Stephens saying it's a positive good. And so things have changed over time, and it's a fascinating story, but it's also just when you drive through or live in, the disadvantaged black neighborhoods in the United States, and you see the continuing lingering effects of these problems that have existed ever since the beginning of this country. And then you run into people who are like, race doesn't matter, or people only care about this because of race hucksters like Al Sharpton. And it's absolutely maddening. And so it's just something that has happened over time. But yeah, I mean, it's the more you learn, I think, and the more you learn about injustice, the more you're going to try and rectify it, at least in my opinion.
So on one of our earlier episodes, we talked about monetary reparations for slavery, and considering a disproportionate amount of African Americans live in destitute poverty, do you think that monetary reparations would be the best way to go about alleviating that?
So there are a couple different. There's a lot to unpack there. So when Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote his fantastic article in defense of reparations, or in support of reparations several years ago, in the Atlantic, I wrote a response. I was writing for a website at the time called Rare, and I came out I was against reparations for slavery. Now, keep in mind, if you actually read Ta-Nehisi's piece, he didn't really talk about slavery all that much. He talked about redlining and the various other real estate-based segregation policies that we're still living with today. These were government-sponsored real estate policies, but also were privately enforced. You had housing covenants and all that sort of stuff. And so you have people who are alive who tangibly were hurt by these policies. And so he was arguing for reparations for them, but he didn't really describe the mechanism, how that would happen. And so when I approached it, I was dealing with it more as a political argument rather than a philosophical one, because I think philosophically, it's hard. Putting a price tag on what America has done to black people throughout its history, there's not enough money on the planet to pay for that. I'm being straight up with you. It's a horrific crime what has been done to black people, and if I got a check in the mail, I mean, I'm doing okay. I mean, it's I'm not rich, but I'm better off than I was when I was growing up, and I'm doing okay. I'm not going to turn down the check, but it's not about whether or not it's whether that should happen, right? As far as how to fix these problems, because politically, what I looked at was, given how people view this country, and particularly white people and the white majority right now, I don't remember, it was a couple of years ago, there's a poll that came out. I'm sorry, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but basically a majority of white Americans believe that anti-white racism was worse than anti-black racism in the United States. If you have a majority of people in this country who believe that, a majority of white people in this country who believe that, if somehow you could move heaven, earth, the moon, the stars, and the galaxy to actually get political reparations through to black Americans, I mean, if Trump was a backlash to Obama, I can't even imagine what that sort of backlash would look like. Any other racial preference or policy, or any other sort of black people, any inequity in how black people survive in this country right now, white people would never want to hear it ever again. Just nope, we gave you a check, it's over, it's done, bye. And so for that reason, I opposed it. It's not that I think that the legacies of racism don't deserve it. I think I mean, you could go back to a Nozikian sort of just property, right, or even Lockean, right? It's You stole labor, you stole property, all these things that have accumulated over time that have been stripped from people. That is not a just accumulation of wealth or property, right? So how do you fix that? Well, you can either give it back, hard to do, everyone's dead, or you can pay off the descendants, right? So I mean, just like practically, politically it's impossible. Practically, I don't think it would be. Well, practically it's impossible. Politically, it's just too costly because we have too many systemic problems that still disadvantage Black people throughout this country. So, for example, if just pick a number, $150,000. So if every Black adult or every, and for the next 40 years, every Black child who reaches the age of 21, every Black person who reaches the age of 21, gets $150,000. If that would fix America's racism problem or America's poverty problem, great. Then everyone should get it, right? But it's not just about the money. It's not just about crushing poverty. I mean, yes, there are a disproportionate number of Black Americans who live in poverty. That's not the only problem with racism in America, right? You have a jogger shot in Georgia that, just jogging down the damn street. So 2 white dudes jump in a truck and shoot him down. That should not happen. But you also have, say, Philando Castile, who was a legal gun owner, who was shot and killed by a police officer in his car. The thing is yeah, that was victimization, and that shouldn't happen. That cop should have been fired and probably prosecuted. That didn't happen. But but the problem is if you actually look into the Philando Castile case, he had been pulled over 49 times, either 48 or 49 times in the previous 10 years. And he had only one of those, I think, was a speeding ticket. And I think one was running a stop sign. Every other time he got pulled over, the reason for being pulled over was either a seatbelt or some other very subjective violation of law, and which everyone does every time they get behind the wheel of a car. Or driving without a license, which is how do you even do that? You can't tell that from, driving down the street. But 49 times in 10 years. That is not normal. That is not okay. That is not, and obviously it wasn't the same cop every time, although the cop that killed him had actually pulled him over before, if I recall correctly. But Black people are still treated differently by our society. Until we change that, the money is not going to be enough. And so rather than move heaven and earth to get that money, I think we need to try different societal tactics to try and make things better. And this is also something that I tell to lefty friends and socialists who are I'm okay, well, if racism is a problem endemic to American society, which I agree with, which most socialists will say, well, most American socialists these days will say, old school, Bernie bros are going to be, not Bernie bros, but Bernie and his ilk were it's class, not race. And in the United States, well, it's both. But it's the same thing as well, okay, you want to put in American style socialism, guess what? It's going to be racist socialism. If that's really that's really an issue. It's whatever your economics are, whatever your view of the role of government, if you believe that American society is still wrestling with race, which again, if you look at the numbers, it's hard to argue with, then you have to figure out how you're going to address that. And it's not just about the money. The money would help, but again, race-based reparations would be, I think, a political nightmare and it would cost more than they would benefit.
We've spoken a bit about libertarian problems with race and racial issues, but do you see libertarians doing anything right or moving in the right direction at all?
Just in the amount of time I was at Cato, for example, they greatly improved, and they intentionally tried to be better about including Black people in the conversation. I mean, frankly, David Bowes wrote this piece, I think, I forget exactly what year it was, talking about, hey, we always talk about going back to the days of the founders and idolizing, the framing generation, the founding generation, without ever thinking about the fact that, people who would have been enslaved back then and whose ancestors were enslaved back then don't look at that era with any sort of, fondness, and sort of rethinking what freedom means to people who aren't the traditional libertarian, acolyte, right? So, and recently, Mike Tanner released this great book called The Inclusive Economy that really sort of challenged the traditional right-left dichotomy. And it's like, if people just live the straight and narrow, they'll be okay, and we need to stop talking about racism. And then looking at the data and saying, actually, even when when Black people stay in school, wait till marriage to have kids, all that sort of stuff, second generation, they get hit again. We need to explain that, and really challenging the traditional notions that racism doesn't matter. And so, but outside of that, there are other organizations and individuals who are saying, no, we believe in freedom for everyone, not that. And we understand that right now that's not what it looks like. Yeah, the law says that people are equal or treats people equally, but in reality, that's not true. And I think that's a very good sign. I think particularly younger libertarians are coming through and really sort of internalizing this and being able to put that into practice in their, in their own writing and then in social media and just how they interact with other people. And so I think that's an excellent opportunity for libertarians to, sort of build out to let other people know that this isn't just that the libertarian way of thinking isn't just about a new way, an intellectual way to support Republican ideas, that it really is its own thing and really is about human flourishing and human equality and human freedom. And so, yeah, I hope that continues. And I wish the libertarians the best.
So it's sort of shifting from like a don't tread on me mentality to a don't tread on anyone.
Yeah, that's a very good way to put it. It is because I think for too long there's just been this assumption that, well, it's not racism, it's the drug war. Stop and frisk data seem to fly in the face of that, right? We talked about the gun recovery units earlier. I think it's too easy to look at an idea in theory and say, oh, well, that's fine. So it's really what I care about this drug war, because I understand, like, on its face is wrong and terrible, and that it happens to have these racially disparate ends. Well, that's also sad, but we just need to get rid of the drug wars, not actually understanding the drug war in the context that is American society and American policing.
So as we begin to wrap up, I was wondering if you had any reading recommendations or if you had any suggestions on race theorists or scholars that libertarians should pay attention to.
I haven't read a lot of race theory. I mean, that the sort of the go-to on that is usually Frantz Fanon. I haven't honestly read any Frantz Fanon. It's just not something that I've really gotten into, because it's like race to me, particularly in the American context, was really about my experience and how I came sort of to terms with being, a black guy who looks white and what that means and all that sort of stuff. What I really think libertarians need to understand, because in American libertarians in particular, is to understand the country that they grew up in and what it looks like to other people. And so that's less about race theory than it is understanding other views of the country we grew up in and that we all grew up in. And so part of that is the 1619 Project is like the easiest one that's like right off the top. But obviously not everything in that project I, can sign off on. Some of that stuff was a little... The thing that really got me was a guy who I actually really respect on work he's done in other realms, but tying an Excel spreadsheet to the plantation was just a little too far. But just sort of understanding the cultural milieu that other people grew up in who weren't white and middle class and affluent and male, usually, was how the libertarians tend to look. And over the past few years, I mean, even since I started at Cato in 2007, like, libertarianism has gotten a lot more diverse, and it's gotten much better about trying to be inclusive and understanding other people's point of views. But I think they still have a long way to go. Specific books that like really opened my eyes. There's The History of White People by Nell Irvin Painter, which is the closest thing to a race theorist that I've read. And it's basically just sort of an accumulation of privilege over time. I can't say it's, I know people have taken shots at the book and they're like, well, it made some, like they hone in on certain claims that may not be 100% accurate. And fair enough. That's a fair critique, I'm sure. But insofar as like the general thrust of the book is just sort of explaining how whiteness has become it's become political power in this country. And I think it's important to understand. For the more philosophical people who like to read Nozick and like really like philosophy, and particularly in classical liberal philosophy, I would recommend Charles W. Mills's Black Rights, White Wrongs. And one of the interesting thing he does is, instead of taking a Marxist approach to like reaction to classical liberal theory, or saying, classical liberalism is bad, he does something that I think is something I think libertarians are very guilty of. He addresses this thing that libertarians are very guilty of, which is sort of making the racial carve out that, well, yes, it's sort of like how we can reconcile how Thomas Jefferson, a man who owned 600 slaves over the course of his life, could write the words "all men are created equal" with a straight face. And it's just sort of like, okay, so yeah, well, they had this blind spot that about race and slavery and equality, but other than that, it's a really good thing to follow, which, obviously I'm sympathetic to, but Mills proceeds with the understanding that wasn't accidental, that they weren't they were being hypocrites, but they understood what they were doing. And it's just a fascinating walk through the philosophy. So I definitely recommend that. Something just basically how our communities look the way they do right now. Richard Rothstein's Color of Law. And he's a progressive, but something that libertarians will appeal to is that he talks about how the government segregated America. And so but the fact of the matter is, like, these are issues that we, still experience today. Again, if you have segregated cities, as most of our, particularly in the North, people like to think of the South as being racist, but if you look around the North, like, most of our cities are segregated, including the one I live in, which is Washington, D.C. And you think, okay, so what does that do? Because our schools are location-based and they're supported by a local tax base, our public schools, that locks people in. And granted, libertarians are good on school choice, and they want to make these exceptions, but that doesn't, that they want, to give those parents more choice so they can send their kids to better schools. But again, you have these areas that are, if not racially homogenous, disparately populated. The incomes there are much lower. The unemployment rate is much higher. Crime rate is predictably higher. And you put them in schools, they sometimes they lack adequate nutrition. They've got all sorts of problems that and that just starts you on your way through an unequal life, where in the DC area, we have some of the best public schools in the country, ranked every year. I think we usually get 4 or 5 in the top 10, right, that are ranked. Of course, those are somewhat arbitrary, but nevertheless, we've got really good public schools around here. Yet we also have, for years, I don't know if it's still true, I haven't looked at the numbers recently, but of 50 states and the district, most money per pupil is DC. Academic performance, 51st, right? Just terrible. these two things happen next to each other, and there is a massive racial component that is going on here, right? So just sort of understanding how all of that can play out through and end up with different outcomes at the end. It's like if you don't address the segregation problem, you're not really going to be able to deal with making things better in this country on a racial level. And then particularly in my realm, which is criminal justice, Khalil Gibran Muhammad's Condemnation of Blackness. If you go to the Cato website, you can actually, one of my last public events there was actually his book event for the re-release of the book. And it basically describes how, among other things, how the way we view crime and the way we measure crime, like crime stats and all this empirical stuff that libertarians are usually into, like empirical data, the way it got started in the United States got off on a really wrong racist foot, and we've never really recovered. And it also just sort of has made the way that sort of evolved, and it's a really great in-depth history, the billion footnotes. It's so well researched, so well written and accessible. Just it shows how race and crime, particularly being black, it has just become synonymous with criminality in this country. And it's a great read, but it is depressing. It's somewhat depressing when you work in it, but like it's just an amazing book that I highly recommend. Just to be like, how can data be like, how can empirical data like have this racist tone, and how could this possibly be true, and not actually just like black people are in fact more criminal, right? Why does that work? And he does a great job of breaking that down, and I highly recommend it. It also, a thing that I talk about during the event is when I first came into libertarianism, I remember. Because there are a bunch of things that, because I didn't really use the L word for a while. I was just like, I was more or less a Republican, but I didn't buy into all the social conservative stuff. And so I got it. I grew up reading P.J. O'Rourke and that sort of stuff. And I'm like, that's definitely more the kind of Republican I am, right? Republican Party reptile changed my life. one of the early books.
John, if you have any final thoughts that you wanted to share?
Just thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's, I give this talk to the interns every semester, but it's also nice to have sort of a more casual, less, less regimented way to go through this. But I really do think that I just want to reiterate the point. I think as much as I'm often critical of libertarians and how they have approached race, and particularly black people in this country for a long time, that they do really have something to offer, but they need to really, really take, the advice to heart. It's like, just assume for a moment that racism actually does have a tangible impact in American society, and it's not just in people's heads. I mean, certainly it is on some level, but insofar as like it has real world consequences. And until libertarians really want to deal with that, I think they're going to be, stuck like preaching to the choir. And I think that's sad. So I really hope that libertarians can start to see the light in that respect, and to change their arguments to deal with these, what I call reality.
I hope so too. Thank you so much for your time. Do you still give the talk to the Cato interns, or?
Yeah. I gave my first one after I left in November. So I gave my last one in February, and I've got another one scheduled, perhaps virtually since the pandemic. But I'm supposed to do it again for the summer class. I still love to do it. It's fun, and it's every class is different. Sometimes they're very receptive. Sometimes it's just like, it was one class. It was just like, I talked to one of the interns who was more sympathetic to my argument, and she was just like, yeah, they were all like, no, it's crap. Let's go see Jordan Peterson up at the Warner that night. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, didn't get through to as many of them as I had hoped, but if I can get through to one, it's worth it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoy your working weekend.
Thanks so much. Take care, man.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Knowledge Problem Podcast. If you liked the episode, please subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Also, consider following our social media accounts to stay up to date on new developments in the show and to share your opinions. We'd like to give one final thank you to our guests today for taking the time to engage in productive conversation. We would like to also thank our sponsors, Young Voices.